All right, thank you. This is really kind of weird, being in front of a group of people talking, something I took for granted for many years of my career and haven't done in 2 years. It feels really, really weird being here doing this. So we're going to talk about the 2016 fires and some air quality issues, and really looking at what the potential effect of prescribed fire could have been on some of the air quality. A little background on this. This isn't... The 2016 fires really provided an opportunity to look at something. So this isn't a criticism of anything that was done. This was just a modeling study that came about because the big question is, for parts of, why do we burn? There's always the argument about, well, part of it's to offset potential health effects from wildfires. And this was a way to start quantifying some of that. This was an example that was fresh in the minds at the time that we started doing a collaboration with CDC on smoke and health impacts. So I had to get my kind of disclaimer out there that I'm in no way criticizing what's done in, in this case, the Cajado Wilderness, how they manage fire. That's not part of this. So the Rough Ridge fire in 2016 was the one we're going to look at specifically. Started in mid-October in the Cajado Wilderness, and then burned on into November, and was pretty much burned out about towards the end of November. Total of around 28,000 acres burned during the period. But of course it was just one of many fires going on. A lot of the time, the fire was fairly low intensity for parts of it. But it had other periods of much greater intensity. So it was kind of a, wide-ranging fire as far as what it was doing. The smoke impacts, we're going to look at particular cases in the middle of November. This is a satellite image from November 14th, and you can see the general Atlanta area. You see smoke is pretty much everywhere, but you see some specific plumes coming in and impacting particular cities in the area. So this is looking at some of the observed stuff from the EPA networks. And so this is on the top 2016 in the PM 2.5 concentration. This is the average daily concentration, and this dotted line here is the EPA ambient air quality standard. So you're supposed to stay below this line to have good air quality. Obviously, there were a couple periods during this fire that we had extremely bad air quality. And just to give kind of a reference is here's the year before. So kind of a baseline, what it would normally look like during November. And you can see that the values are averaging below 10, with some as low as 5.5 and 6. And, like I said, the fire started in early October, and then evens by, early November, values are double what they were in the previous year. And that's kind of just that residual smoke that you saw across the whole area. But then when you get into the periods where we had the actual plumes hitting on the monitors on those days of increased activity, we're looking at 7 to 10 times what the reference was of the previous year's value. So very significant smoke impacts from this fire. So the kind of the pieces we want to look at that go into this are, 2016 was an exceptional drought. How much of that was the drought? How much of it was the accumulation of Duff in the forests? For air quality, Duff is one of the worst fuel types because it quite often burns at a fairly low intensity, so it doesn't create a large smoke plume that distributes the smoke through a deep layer of the atmosphere. It tends to keep it down near the ground. So you get more smoke down near the surface, which is where we are, and which will directly lead to our health impacts. And then one little piece we're going to look at is we found a way to kind of estimate what it would have looked like if this fire had been prescribed burn on a regular basis before this fire. And again, this isn't a criticism of how the land is managed. This was just an example of where we could do in the computer, with the simulations, we could do a little experiment and see what it looked like. So we're going to look at how this thing would have been modeled by the Blue Sky smoke modeling framework, which is very similar to what the Weather Service uses for their air quality predictions and what the EPA AirNow system uses for making air quality forecasts. They're all basically based on this same framework. And we're going to look at the data that would typically go into it. We're going to look at some on-the-ground estimates to see how good their estimates would have been, and then see what the prescribed fire piece would be. So this is kind of an overview of the Blue Sky framework. And what Blue Sky does is it takes information about a fire, links it to fuel information. For this work, it'll either be from the Fuel Characteristic Classification System, FCCS, which is the primary way fuels are classified in Blue Sky. And then the other fuel loads will come from actual measurements in the vicinity of the fire, as well as this hypothetical prescribed fire fuel loading and moisture. And then it uses, takes the fire information and fuels, and it estimates consumption using a model called Consume, which is used by a lot of people when they're doing their smoke management. And then the emissions are calculated using the fire emissions production system. And then it goes into the meteorology and transport, and we move the smoke around. So over here we have the fire perimeter, and we have so this is the early peak would have been the area burning around the 11th and the 10th and 11th of November, and then the later peak would have been around the 14th, and that would have been the gold areas that burned in that time. And so what we did to get our fuel estimates for our measured is we set up some paired plots where we went in after the fire, and we found areas around the perimeter of what burned that day, both inside and outside of the burn. So we could get something close by that didn't burn to give us an estimate of what it would have looked like pre-burn, pre-fire. And we did that in both areas. And fortunately, for the prescribed fire case, for plots 3 and 4 up here, there was an area that had been prescribed burn. And so we were able to sample that area too to get an estimate of what the fuels would have looked like if this whole area had been prescribed burned. So that's kind of where our prescribed fire case comes from, is we found someplace close by that had been prescribed burned on a regular basis. And so we then applied those fuels to this area with these moisture conditions. The predominant fuels are going to be some hardwood cove forests, some mixed oak pines transitioning to some pines, so fairly typical mix of forests for the southern Appalachians. So we had our 2 peaks in the smoke. The 10th, we had smoke pretty much streaming from the areas of the fires right down across into Atlanta. And then we had the period where there wasn't a lot of smoke. We actually, cloud cover suppressed the fire activity a little bit. We had a little bit of an increase in moisture contents in some of the fuels, lower emissions. So and also a wind shift that sent the fire away from the smoke away from Atlanta. And then things flipped back around for the second peak on the 14th and put smoke back into the Atlanta area. So just a little bit on the drought. Keith-Byram drought index, it had been climbing for basically months and had reached over, just under 700 across the region. And to give you an idea, the Keith-Byram drought index is based on the idea of there being about 8 inches of available water in the upper layers of soil. And that upper layer of soil can be about 30 inches deep. So this is saying that you had less than you were missing 7 inches of that water basically. So you had about 1 inch of soil and 1 inch of water in the upper 30 inches of soil. That's not a lot of water to spread across there for plants to pull on. So that's pretty extreme drought. And then looking at the 10-hour fuel moistures, which is the blue line, you can kind of see around the 10th, we had a dip and then we had those clouds come in. And that raised the 10-hour fuel moistures and decreased the fire behavior a little bit. And then they started going back down, and we got the other peak in emissions that we were going to look at that are around the 14th and 15th. But the big thing is the drought was here and ever present, and the drought is what's going to drive the consumption of the Duff. This was just an example of the fire emissions calculations. This is using what's called Blue Sky Playground. This is a web-based tool that's available to anybody. You just have to register and get a username that allows you to calculate emissions and smoke production and then look at smoke dispersion. It was just to show some of the general outputs in the form. Really just a filler slide. The fuel classification system, this is one of the land fire layers that is used by Blue Sky to estimate the fuels. So you give it a location, it goes and checks this map and comes up with what the fuels are within that area. And one of the reasons that we use FCCS for this over some of the other fuel modeling options is mainly because it's how it splits the fuel bed up into different strata, so that we can see a lot more information. It's a little bit more intuitive, and it does a good job of differentiating litter and ground fuels or Duff. And the Duff was what we were really interested in for this project. So here's just some examples kind of showing where there was Duff and, well, no longer any Duff. The fires, as we'll show a little bit later, were quite effective under these drought conditions at consuming Duff. It was basically 100% consumption. But the fuel loadings, if you look at what FCCS had, which is the green, so this is what comes out of land fire. If you pick the location around the Rough Ridge fire, these would be your fuel loadings. And you can see that, there's a little bit of 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, and 1,000 hour, and they're fairly consistent between the two sites we had for those 2 days where we actually took the measurements. They're consistent until you start to look at really the Duff. And you can see that the FCCS layer had half the Duff that was actually in those plots. And part of that's kind of a fault of how we do a lot of our fuel assessment. It gets sampled, and then we go, that's the fuel model, that's how much Duff there's going to be. Come back a year later, and if you measured it again, your answer would be different. If you haven't had a disturbance like fire that consumes the Duff, it might have just continued to accumulate, and they don't account for that in a lot of these fuel products. And we can see it's, again, pretty much at least double. The areas that we measured had double the Duff that was observed. And that kind of makes a big difference when you total up all the fuel that was available to be consumed. Basically, again, a factor of 2 difference. When we look at consumption, and this is calculated from the consume model would be in the green, and then the blue and red are the difference between the inside and outside fuel location sites. So you can see that, the consumption of the litter, the 1 hour, the 10 hour, the 100 hour, all really good, really consistent. We didn't see a lot of 1,000-hour consumption in our measured plots, and they were saying that we should have consumed 80% of the 1,000-hour fuels. That looks like that would be a big error, but if we go back to what the fuel load was, that's not going to produce that much of an error, because compared to the total that's in the Duff layer, it's a small amount of fuel. When we look at the errors on the Duff side, you can see that, you know, in many of our sites, we consumed 100% or 75% to 100% of the Duff got consumed on that fire. But the Blue Sky tools, the consume model was saying it was actually around 25%. So what that does to the emissions, well, the base business as usual Blue Sky had much lower emissions for the 2 days than what was actually would have been from the observed values. Another piece we did was we took the consume model and ran it with both the moisture content for the 2016 and the moisture content of a normal year. And what that does is it takes that consumption and brings it back down. So it's really the combination of, if you had had normal moisture content, you wouldn't have consumed very much of that Duff. So it was a combination of higher than expected. Let me not say normal, because it's what's expected is from the FCCS. So you had more Duff than what they expected there to be, and you were burning it under drier conditions than the model had probably ever seen. So it was definitely off in what it estimated. And so, as anybody could probably guess, the smoke emissions predictions, if you used Blue Sky for, you know, just business as usual predictions, it wasn't going to predict. Blue Sky is normal, so it's the FCCS fuels with the limited Duff and their underestimate of Duff consumption. On the 11th, on the 10th and 11th, you put a little bit of smoke in Atlanta, but you keep most of the unhealthy smoke out of the Atlanta area, a little bit in the Gainesville area, but you don't produce the kind of episodes that we saw from the EPA data. So when the Weather Service did their smoke forecasting for these fires, their forecasts were way off because they had no idea how much smoke was actually on the ground. I mean, how much Duff was actually on the ground. And it was very similar for the 14th and 15th case, that they just didn't produce the smoke getting into the Atlanta area that was observed. Now, when we look at the actual measurements, you can kind of see that the green is the EPA measurements, and, you know, overall the model, that's not really that bad considering how little the model actually knows about what was on the ground. But it's getting the peak at the wrong times and putting it in the wrong place. Totally missed high smoke concentrations through the middle of the day on the, so just not great. When we go to, so that's FCCS. Okay, so this is the, again, the baseline case, and when we change the moisture content, you can see we again get this, you know, we reduce how much Duff gets consumed, we get the smoke out of Atlanta. You know, so in a normal year, those fires would have caused nowhere near the health impact that they ended up producing. But this is the interesting slide. If we replace those fuels with what would have been seen for the area that was prescribed burn. And the big thing about prescribed burning is it manages that Duff layer, if you do it right. You know, you can keep that Duff layer fairly well and manage it so that in the event of a wildfire, you know, we sent smoke in all the right directions, but none of the unhealthy levels got into the Atlanta area or the other major metropolitan areas. And what we're basically doing is we're trading off when we're emitting the smoke. Do we emit it all under the worst conditions of extreme drought with high buildups of Duff, or do we take off small amounts of that Duff in repeated prescribed burns, manage where we send it, because we all know that if we're doing a prescribed burn, we're not sending the smoke into Atlanta on any of those days. We're going to kind of pick the wind directions that go away from Atlanta. So we basically can manage how that smoke gets into the system. And that's the real key. You know, overall, the same amount of Duff ends up getting consumed over, you know, the long term, but we've managed how we put it into the system and where the impacts are going to occur. So there's a bunch of boring stuff here, but the real take-home message is that prescribed fire does have health benefits. I mean, we are releasing smoke, which, you know, can't say that smoke is healthy. But the big question is, is it better in small, frequent doses or very large, acute doses all at once? And based on hospital admissions data, it's definitely better in smaller doses.